I've heard it said that if you eat in an Oxford University dining hall, that for just about any question you ask, there will be someone in the room who can address the topic you raised. I feel it must be something like this right here in the University Club, a room, well, Zoom in this case, filled with people with curious minds and an appetite for history who meet each month to learn even more. Normally, maybe not here, but often when I mention the word Chautauqua, most people stare back at me with a blank face, never having heard the term. And yet, a century ago, the term was as familiar as the word internet is today. An estimated 20 to 30 million Americans attended a Chautauqua in over 9,000 towns across this nation in the summer of 1924 alone. And I'm going to try to convince you today that the Chautauqua movement was a force that served to shape the minds and souls of small town Americans and that helped to unify our country. They were unified by a system of community education and entertainment that exposed Americans across the nation to the same issues and to the same culture. My focus will be the traveling Chautauquas that took the initial idea and brought it to thousands of communities throughout the United States and even into Canada and Alaska. So, what was a traveling Chautauqua, also called a circuit Chautauqua? What was this movement that spread across our country from shore to shore, beginning in 1904, and then for the next 28 years, finally coming to an end in September of 1932? What caused President Theodore Roosevelt to call Chautauqua the most American thing in America? To answer these questions, we must begin in the far western corner of upstate New York, as far as you can get from New York City and still be in the state. This area where you have the red circle, very rural part of the state. And it's named, the whole Chautauqua movement is named for the lake. The lake is named from an Indian word, perhaps Seneca. I'm not exactly certain, but it probably means bag tied in the center. So this 17-mile long lake seems to be something like a bag tied right about halfway at Bemis Point. It narrows at that point. And it all began with two men who had a common vision and a sacred calling. John Hyle Vincent, who was a Methodist minister and the secretary of the Sunday School Union, and Lewis Miller, who had been a teacher but gave that up to become a wealthy manufacturer and inventor of farm machines. But he never lost his interest in education. These two men recognized the power of education to elevate and to enlarge life. They saw a need for improved instruction for Sunday school teachers, many of whom had had no formal training at all. Their vision was to have teachers from all denominations meet for an illuminated understanding of the Bible. So clearly this was a Christian focus, but as you'll see momentarily, they never isolated religion from the rest of life. Religious education, they believed, must be taught alongside the knowledge of secular disciplines. So here, Reverend Vincent says, education, once the peculiar privilege of the few, must in our best earthly estate become the valued possession of the many. And elsewhere, he wrote, the old world of history, the new world of science, the rich world of literature, the royal world of art are skylights through which the individual looks up and sees the world of God, his love and holiness, and the boundless life to which he invites us. So, if God created the whole universe, then everything is part and parcel of God's being. Science, literature, art, music, and these became topics brought up in the Chautauquas. So in 1874, this is what the speakers would have seen looking out. 2,500 Sunday school teachers attended the first year for a 2-week session. That That site was Miller Park, and this is Miller Park today. Chautauqua became a permanent idea. It still exists in New York State, and then it spread to other places as well. So after the first year, word of mouth and periodicals made this such a popular thing that it continued to grow every single year. People started to want to build summer cottages and come here and spend the summers and be part of this educational, religious, musical center. One of the people who came was Thomas Edison. His house is on the bottom left, also on the circle here of Miller Park, though not in the picture on the right. He had a summer place here. He had a house in Fort Myers. He had a house up in New Jersey. Within just a few years, people were building guest houses. So you could rent a room at one of the guest houses, and down at the end of the street, you can see the roof of the amphitheater. Looks sort of like a wooden tent. So just keep the tent idea in mind. 5,000 people can sit here. And this is kind of the heart of the institution. At the moment, we're looking at the Chautauqua Symphony Orchestra. It's a summer orchestra, all professional musicians who reside here for the summer, and their performances 2 to 3 nights a week from the orchestra. But lectures take place here in the mornings. Performances of all sorts take place. Every night there's something. So in 2019, when I was last here, I saw Diana Ross and Judy Collins, both about 80 years old, I believe. But there are younger groups like Black Violin, you might know from PBS, and comedy, comedians, opera singers, dancers, performers of all kinds come. The grounds also have classes, classrooms. There are over 300 classes on everything from robotics to Italian Renaissance art you can take. There are lecture halls like this one, Grand Hotel, the Athenaeum, and many smaller hotels as well. It's a very family-oriented place, lots of classes for kids. The oldest Boys and Girls Club in America is right here on the grounds of Chautauqua. This is the place where your child would leave you after breakfast to go off and do whatever, and you might not see him or her again until lunch or dinner time. And it's a very, very safe place. So back to the amphitheater, and this I'm showing to pull us back to 1874. Remember this Sunday school group of teachers attending in those early years. Well, in 1874, it all began. The very next year, President Grant spoke. He had been a former parishioner of Reverend Vincent's church in Illinois, and this initiated the tradition of bringing important speakers to Chautauqua. Music was also added this summer when a group of former slaves performed plantation songs of the American South. And just 2 years later, and by the way, I might say that Chautauqua eventually would become one of the foremost summer music centers in the country, sort of like Tanglewood in Massachusetts and Interlochen in Michigan. Gershwin wrote his Concerto in F at Chautauqua. A couple of years later, science demonstrations were added as yet another element of God's universe. There were lectures on chemistry, biology, astronomy, and all the while, attendance at Chautauqua continued to swell, and the idea spread. Within 4 years after the start of the New York Chautauqua, there were over half a dozen Chautauquas in 6 states as far west as California that imitated that model. By the end of the century rather, there were over 60 of these Chautauquas that met every single summer in 30 of the 48 states. And then just 4 years after that, the traveling Chautauquas will begin, and that will be my focus. But before I get to that, a little aside, I want to emphasize that there was a hunger for learning. And today, our hunger is satisfied by instantaneous information on the internet and turning on the TV. And most of us get educated for many, many years. In the middle of the 19th century, only about 50% of children attended school. By 1900, there were 30 states who had compulsory schooling laws, but that was only requiring attendance until age 14. In 1910, 18% of 15 to 18-year-olds enrolled in a high school, and only 9% of 18-year-olds graduated. You might say, well, okay, they could go to a library. But libraries were scarce, especially in small towns. Andrew Carnegie really changed the landscape of libraries anyway when he promised to build and furnish a library to any city that agreed to maintain and staff it. But most of the small towns couldn't agree to pay the money to staff it. He gave over $60 million. Maybe that's about $400 million today. I'm not sure. But a total of 1,689 Carnegie libraries were built in the US between 1883 and 1929. By the way, if you wanted to uh, learn more about one of those 60 uh, sites that had independent Chautauquas, like the one in New York, you just have to go, 45 minutes up Route 441 to find Mount Dora. Actually, it might be a little bit of a difficulty to find where it was held, but Mount Dora had a Chautauqua starting in 1887. It lasted only 20 years, but probably if the buildings hadn't burned down, there was a fire and they had several buildings that burned down, it might have continued on. But during those 20 years, they drew thousands of people each year for the 10-day retreat. Steamers made daily trips across the lake. Special trains were scheduled to bring visitors daily to the grounds. And there's a community named Chautauqua Park after this historical event that occurred there. So the traveling Chautauqua is a product of three movements of the 19th century. The Chautauqua movement that I just talked about, the Lyceum movement, a fascinating movement because how it responded to the need for learning and discussion and debate, and the multiple traveling tent shows that occurred in the 19th century. The Lyceum movement in America brought traveling lecturers and performers to towns. There weren't just lectures, there were speeches, there were debates, there was instructions, particularly on science, there were dramatic performances. The first one was founded, I think, by Josiah Holbrook in 1826 in Massachusetts. 2 years later, 100 of these. The next decade, 3,000 lyceums in the United States. Abraham Lincoln spoke at one, and they spoke on topics ranging from temperance to physical education to science. All of these people and many more spoke on the lyceums. I wonder, it took forever for suffrage finally to pass, but I wonder if it might have taken longer if it hadn't been for so many people speaking about the topic through lyceums and at Chautauquas, spreading this idea throughout the country. And then look at the array of writers and thinkers. P.T. Barnum should be added to this. I would have loved to have been, I'm not sure what year this is, but in this winter, you have in Concord, you have Ralph Waldo Emerson, James Freeman Clark, Horace Greeley, Go West Young Man, Wendell Phillips, and Henry David Thoreau gave a talk on civil disobedience before he ever wrote it down as an essay. Another little aside, but I want to emphasize that today we think of the fine arts as art, music, theater, dance, drama, and so forth. But in most small towns in America, uh, yes, they had music. They had the church choir. They had the piano in the parlor. They had someone playing guitar or singing out on the front porch. But the idea of professional musicians coming into town, of actors performing professionally, that was rather rare. But one thing they did have was oratory. Perhaps, and I think this is discussed in one or both of these books, oratory might be considered the highest, the most popular art form of the 19th century. In fact, one woman said it was the Lyceum, which aroused the minds of our grandfathers, afforded them greater opportunities for study, and made their lives broader and better able to understand and appreciate the gifts of God and men, of God and men. This was the goal of the Chautauquas as well. So the third movement, the traveling tent shows. Uncle Tom's Cabin was so popular, it was made into a play, and I read someplace that it's estimated that over 50% of Americans watched a performance of Uncle Tom's Cabin in what's called a Tom show. Medicine shows traveled in tents, ultimately to sell you an elixir, but to entertain you along the way. Camp meetings like revivals occurred with hymn singing and itinerant preachers. And of course, there were circuses that traveled in tents at the time. So you take the idea of the summer Chautauqua, the idea of a traveling lyceum, and the idea of tent shows, and give that to Keith Vaughter. He was the Western manager for the Redpath Lyceum Bureau. The Redpath Bureau functioned like a talent agency. It provided speakers and entertainers for lyceums. Lyceums met mostly in the fall, winter, and spring, rarely in the summer. Why not take these ideas, these three 19th century ideas, and provide talent to traveling summer Chautauquas in tents, thereby bringing the ideas to small towns. So it would work like this. In a circus, the entire circus arrives in town on the same day and they all leave together. Not so with the Chautauquas. So maybe in Winter Park on Tuesday, there would be a lecturer and the David Lindstrom players. And they would leave and head to Oviedo for perform the same thing on Wednesday. On Wednesday in Winter Park, though, you'd have the Lucille Elmore Company and Senator Barkley that would perform and speak. They would leave and go off to Oviedo, and the first day performers would go to Ocala, and their first day of the Chautauqua would be on a Thursday. But on Thursday in Winter Park, you'd have an orchestral quintet and some lecturer. In 1904, there were 15 towns who were served by Vaughter's first Chautauqua, traveling Chautauqua in Iowa and Nebraska. By 1921, there were 9,000 towns, and there were 21 different independent bureaus, each serving a different area of the United States. This map shows 1915, and each dot represents a town that a traveling Chautauqua visited. It was primarily a Midwestern thing to begin with. In 1912, this is an easier map to see. You can see in 1912, there were 41 towns. By a decade later, 797 towns, reaching into Canada, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Isle, Nova Scotia. It was very popular in Canada as it was in the United States. Vancouver, especially out Western Canada, really loved Chautauquas. Chautauqua became so popular that Chautauqua Week became the annual event not to be missed. They used brown tents. All the other tent shows were white tents. So Vaughter wanted to do something different. This is a different sort of thing. It's opera singers are coming to town. It's activists. It's lecturers. And so he did something a little different. And the tents could be raised, the sides could be raised to help capture a breeze if it was a particularly hot day. I'm showing this kind of blurry slide just to give an idea of how big these tents were. 2,000 was not unusual to accommodate people. In the early days, people came by horse and buggy. Eventually, by 1922, here we've got them coming in automobiles. Here's the speaker inside, a little difficult to see, so he's highlighted in yellow, but the audience would face the stage, unlike a circus, which uses an arena kind of plan. And this is what the speaker would see. Oftentimes the children would sit up front, pretty crowded in there. And there are some stories, I don't know how common it was, of kids throwing spit wads or peanut shells up at the speaker. I'm sure in those days, if their parents saw that happening, they wouldn't be sitting down for several days thereafter. This picture of Senator La Follette makes me think of TED Talks. And in fact, lyceums and Chautauquas were early day TED Talks. They were ideas worth spreading. So you could buy a ticket for $2 to $3, depending on the year and the location. And or you could just buy not just a season ticket, you could buy a daily ticket, give it to the ticket collector. But long before you did that, it was all advertised. There were opening day parades in most of these places. There were banners stretched across the streets advertising the upcoming Chautauqua. There were pins, there were advertisements. Sometimes there were postcards sent out. I love this, where all you've got to do is write the person's name and the town and state he's in, and it's going to get to him. But think about this. 20 excellent programs in this Sibley Chautauqua in 7 days. In a small town, the idea that you would have people coming from all over the world, certainly all over the United States, and many times from the rest of the world, 20 different lecturers and singers and magicians and performers of all sorts coming to your town. It had to have been exciting. And the other side of the postcard showing what's going to bring it all to town. There were programs. So we see here a play at the bottom. Smilin' Through was a play that began on Broadway in New York and then went on the circuits. There are musicians and lecturers here. On the left, we see a cover of a program which shows a picture of a tent boy, as he was called, one of the tent crew, usually just 2 or 3 people who put up the tent. They were college kids, very popular. They would put up the tent the day before the program began and take it down afterwards. And in between, they would fill all kinds of jobs like collecting tickets. But notice the Nothing But the Truth was a comedy first performed on Broadway. Someone speaking about Bolshevism. There's a band. All kinds of exciting things coming to town. In the middle of the program would be oftentimes what you could call the centerfold, showing all of these different performers and lecturers coming to our town. Had to have been exciting. Now, I'm a teacher, so I give tests. It's one of the things I do. So I've got a test for you. It's really Trivial Pursuit for history buffs. How many stars can you identify on the Chautauqua circuits? And really the reason I'm doing this is to impress upon you the variety and also the fame of some of these people that even today we might recognize. So I'll start with this gentleman who was on the circuits for 2 decades, over a 3-decade period. He was a congressman from Nebraska. He was Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson. He died right after the Scopes trial, which he prosecuted in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925. And yes, this is William Jennings Bryan. As far as I know, the only candidate for a major party to become president who ran 3 times and happened to lose. But he was an amazing speaker. You can hear tapes of him, recordings. They say his voice resounded and could be heard well outside of the tent. When he spoke, you had to listen. And he had a great rhetorical skill as well. And his speeches, many of them still survive. This face you might not know, but you might have heard of a very popular baseball player who became converted to Christianity and became an evangelist. He said, going to church doesn't make you a Christian any more than going to a garage makes you an automobile. This is Billy Sunday. Rather rare to have evangelists because it'd be like preaching to the converted. And as a matter of fact, rare to have an evangelist on the circuits. But the Chautauqua circuits, there were other circuits, yes. But in any event, he most commonly spoke to the Chautauqua circuits on prohibition. This fellow, you on the right, you would probably recognize if I showed a picture of him when he was older, but you might recognize him just because he's got a dummy, an early form of Charlie McCarthy. This is Edgar Bergen, who claimed that he learned how to perform in public during the summers when he took off from college and went on the Chautauqua circuits. And He did magic performances mixed in with ventriloquist acts. This gentleman was younger when he spoke on the circuits, but you might recognize Carl Sandburg, who not only read his poems, but also sometimes gave lectures. I think more commonly gave lectures such as on Walt Whitman. You'd recognize her maybe if the picture were of her older, but this was from 1912, the time that she was on the circuits. She did not speak about being blind or being deaf. She spoke most frequently about women's suffrage. We have prayed, we have coaxed, she said. We have begged for the vote with the hope that men, out of chivalry, would bestow equal rights upon women and take them into partnership in the affairs of the state. So going a little faster, Booker T. Washington, founder of the Tuskegee Institute, speaking on his favorite subject, educating African Americans. You probably wouldn't recognize this man if I didn't choose a picture in his North Pole garb, but this is Frederick Cook, the first man to discover the North Pole. Or was he? Robert Peary claims he was, and of course this is still debated today, some people thinking neither of them actually reached it, but Frederick Cook went on these circuits, I think for 3 years, not only talking about the glories of the North and the incredible hardships of reaching the pole, but also trying to convince audiences that he really did make it there first. Another face you might not know, but Maud Ballington married into the British Booth family. They had founded the Salvation Army, and she and her husband moved to the United States, founded the Volunteers of America. Her passion was prison reform. That's what she spoke about. She visited prisons all the time. Every penny she made on the circuits went to prison reform. Muckrakers you're probably familiar of from high school and beyond. These are people who exposed corruption in government and in society. Ida Tarbell brought the Standard Oil Company to its knees. Lincoln Steffens wrote a book on the shame of the cities, and that's one of the topics he spoke on. Jacob Riis was a Danish immigrant who took photographs of the tenements in New York City and put them into a book with text on how the other half lives, and that's the topic of one of his lectures. These are faces you probably wouldn't recognize, but the names probably. A social, Eugene Debs. The socialism was talked about on the circuits. Jane Addams founded Hull House and was a social reformer. She mostly spoke on suffrage. And you wouldn't have recognized her maybe if she didn't have her trademark hatchet, but Carrie Nation was an advocate for the temperance movement. She would take her hatchet, break up saloons, smash them, and then get arrested, pay her way out with money she made on the circuits, and then go to another town and repeat. 6 presidents. So since I'm testing you, of course, you probably recognize Theodore Roosevelt. Taft might be a little more difficult to recognize. Wilson, I think, is more familiar to us. Harding, Coolidge, Hoover. And the rest of these, the test kind of ends. The rest of these are faces and maybe names you don't recognize, but they show us the range that's going on. Gifford Pinchot could be a speaker on the TED Talk stage today. There are plenty of people speaking on the green movement and eco-politics. He did it over a century earlier than the TED Talk speakers. He said, unless we practice conservation, those who come after us will have to pay the price of misery, degradation, and failure for the progress and prosperity of our day. And this is more true today than it was. He was father of American conservation and worked as the chief of the Division of Forestry. If you head into a grocery store and think so many of our foods are incredibly unhealthy for us, think about 1900. Some food products were tainted with unhealthy additives and chemicals. Some milk was watered down and whitened with plaster of Paris, chalk, and even calf brains. Coffee beans often included sawdust. I learned all this from this book by Deborah Blum called The Poison Squad. She spoke on NPR, where I first heard it. And she's writing this book about Dr. Harvey Wiley, who actually formed a poison squad to test some of the foods that were coming out in that time without all of the regulations that we have today. He was the chief chemist in the Department of Agriculture, and probably his greatest accomplishment was passing the Pure Food and Drug Act, which required food inspections, food labeling, and approved purity levels of drugs. But he met up with so much bureaucratic red tape that he just quit his job and went directly to the people, speaking on the circuits for nearly 20 years. Early women politicians, the first state governor in the United States, the first woman elected to Congress. Jeanette Rankin said, "We're half the people, we should be half the Congress." And that still hasn't been realized. She also said, "I may be the first woman member of Congress, but I won't be the last," which makes me think that Kamala Harris was alluding to her when she made her famous quote. During World War I, the war was a very common topic. And then after the war, people like Private Pete talked about their experiences. He lost his arm in the war. He wrote a book about it, and he went about describing the horrors that they experienced there. Look at this. Almost every topic you can think of. These are just some of them. Juvenile delinquency, eugenics before it became a big subject in Germany, ancient cliff dwellers, and topics of Indians or Native Americans of all sorts were very popular. Japan, Tolstoy, wild bird guests, nature. Lots of the speakers were uplift speakers talking about things like the man who can. And Sarah Tyson Rohrer was the Julia Child of her day. She actually gave demonstrations to groups of cooking, and she wrote a dozen cookbooks and talked on the circuits about the importance of vegetables and good nutrition. I talk about this as a religious movement, this Chautauqua movement. It began as a Protestant effort, but there were Catholic and Jewish clerics, as well as non-clerics, who addressed audiences. You've got to remember that when it was formed, Protestants were the huge majority in the United States. In 1850, only 5% of the population was Catholic. By 1900, after the Irish potato famine and other things happening in Europe, it increased to 17% and increased after that. Jews in America numbered 250,000 in 1880, reached 2 million by 1910, and went up above that. So it becomes a movement. There were actually Jewish Chautauquas around 1900. Now, I'm pretty sure that Garrison Keillor never presented in one of those traveling Chautauquas, because they ended in 1932, and I'm pretty sure he was born much after that. But I bring him out for a reason. First of all, he did actually perform his whole radio show at least twice in the New York Chautauqua. But think about what Prairie Home Companion is. It's kind of revives what the golden age of radio was all about in the 1930s and 40s. It brings us comedy, music, drama, storytelling, poetry reading. Well, remember that the Chautauquas that traveled throughout the United States, this was essentially pre-radio day. So you could think of a Chautauqua as a Prairie Home Companion that lasted an entire week in the small towns that they traveled to. There was theater. Ben Greet was a famous Shakespearean actor and director of his own theater troupe. Shakespeare was performed on the circuits. The Melting Pot was first performed on Broadway in New York in 1908. Look at what it deals with. It's dealing with immigration. Now, the first decade of the 20th century, when this came out, more immigrants reached the shores of the United States than in any decade before, and more than any decade since. I think it's 9 million, 9 million immigrants coming into America in that one decade alone. Consider the issues of immigration we're dealing with today, not nearly that number. And Angela Merkel inviting 1 million non-Germans into Germany several years ago, and some of the difficulties it raised. Of course, our country is much larger. But anyway, one of the characters in the play says, America is God's crucible. It's the great melting pot where all the races of Europe are melting and reforming. And it put a very positive spin at what it's doing to make our country great. There was music of all kinds, banjo trios, Swiss yodelers, Hawaiian guitarists. Uh, Bohumir Krill had performed with the Sousa Band and then began his own professional band out of Chicago. Notice the performer, the program. Wagner, an aria from an opera that was popular at the day, Gounod's Faust. These were professional musicians. If a town had a community band, they would have heard the difference when 30 to 40 people in this professional band arrived into town and played with the quality that the Krill band was noted for. There were opera singers, several of them. The most famous, kind of the Renee Fleming or the Maria Callas of her day, Madame Ernestine Schumann-Heink from Austria, eventually settled in the United States and would give performances very popular, like most people had never heard before. Then there were also about 15 different groups of Jubilee singers. These were African Americans who sang songs from the plantations, very popular. That was the 1909 recording of the Fisk Jubilee Singers. And there were musicians from all parts of the world. Hawaii was not part of the United States. There were alpine yodelers. There were New Zealand performances and many other places. There was art, chalk talkers who would draw and tell stories and jokes. And at the time, one of them would draw a picture of the mayor of the town with a bow tie and then turn it upside down, and the bow tie became a bow on the head of a baby. Sculptors and painters would perform and talk. There was humor. Opie Reed was from Arkansas, an Arkansan humorist, something like Mark Twain. He eventually settled in Chicago and became a journalist and writer there, but he always wrote about Arkansas. Old Lynn Jucklin was one of his characters who was willing to tell his philosophy about life about anything on his front porch, such as politics. If your son-in-law is hesitating between politics and the penitentiary, remember that if he goes to the penitentiary, you won't have to take care of him. And funerals. There's been more lies told in preaching funerals than in making love, and they weren't half as necessary. There was magical performances of all sorts, popular with the kids as well as the adults. There were travelogues, many of them with lantern slides, early forms of slide projectors, showing pictures of other parts of the world. And there were children's Chautauquas, where a Chautauqua lady, as she was a Chautauqua girl or story lady, as she was sometimes called, you can see in the picture on right, would keep the kids entertained, not only by telling stories, but by having them help prepare for a pageant. And at the end of the week, there might be a parade, such as you see on the left, for parents to watch their kids in the parade. So I think of it like summer camp for an entire week. In a small town. There was criticism about the Circuit Chautauquas. Sinclair Lewis, the great writer, I think his best book was Main Street. He said these Chautauquas were nothing but wind and chaff and heavy laughter, the laughter of yokels at old jokes, a mirthless and primitive sound like the cries of beasts on a farm. And a writer in the Saturday Review called them a potpourri of entertainment cunningly devised in the name of religion and culture to attract the dollars of rural Americans hungry for self-improvement. They reveal the pathetic sterility of the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans in thousands of towns. Well, there may be some truth to this. There certainly were plenty of people leaving the towns and moving to the cities. But the sound of these, the laughter of yokels like cries of beasts, the pathetic sterility. I wonder if even today, most people living in the country actually think of their lives as being pathetically sterile. Um, I get the feeling that these are city people uh, who have criticism about country people, as more so maybe than the Chautauquas. Who knows? But the fact is, most people who attended the Chautauquas had positive things to say. One woman said it made the map of the world come alive. Another said it brought men who knew the world from having traveled in it, who were leaving us as custodians of the truth they spread. One man said it was like light coming into your life. And a man in the 1950s, looking back on his childhood, said it was the most exciting event of any year in our lives. And remember Ida Tarbell, the muckraker who spoke on the circuits for 2 or 3 summers? She says, it was the audience that brought me to my knees. They were so serious, they listened so intently to get something. And the tragedy was that I had not more to give them. They were making up their minds, and their minds were open. She believed the audiences were sharp, attentive, and ready to learn. And I want to come to a close fairly soon by conveying the idea of what William Jennings Bryan said when the Chautauquas were still functioning. They're a potent human factor in molding the mind of the nation. And I believe this really did happen. They helped connect rural and urban audiences. Both rural and urban audiences heard many of the same lecturers discuss many of the same issues, whether it was socialism, nutrition, conservation, whatever, because most of the lecturers came from the cities and they lectured there as well as lecturing on the Chautauqua circuits. Most of the plays on the circuits came from Broadway or Chicago, and most of the musical groups performed in the cities as well as in the country. Remember, this was the progressive era. Most history books date the era between 1890 and 1920 as the progressive era, an age of reform in America, when muckrakers exposed corruption, women gained vote, laws set minimum wage, prohibition was ratified and repealed, laws were passed such as antitrust laws, compulsory education laws, juvenile courts were formed, and massive immigration was a topic spoken about in both the city and the country. So the circuits brought these issues to the doorsteps of small town America and in turn affected change. So why did they come to an end? Well, one thing that happened is the movement became commercialized. The original mission was for education and betterment, but it became cheapened by trying to just make a lot of money on it with rather uh, simple entertainment that really wasn't sophisticated. Remember, too, the roaring 20s is when this pretty much comes to an end. And there were more moral and social changes of the age that would look at the Chautauqua ideals as being somewhat antiquated in small town. And in 1920, we have the first census report that shows more people living in urban areas than living in rural areas. And rural residents tended to be viewed as backwards and provincial. There were also changes in transportation and technology. Automobiles made it easier to travel from a small town to a larger town for entertainment and lectures and so forth. Radios were sort of like Chautauqua, uh, delivered right into your living room. Because they had variety shows and dramas and so forth. And sound movies brought drama to your town if you had a movie theater in quite a different way than the silent movies did. And finally, in 1929, the Great Depression hammered the final nail into the coffin of the traveling Chautauquas. But the Chautauqua movement didn't come to an end. If you type Chautauqua Trail into your search engine, you will find this map. All of these 17 places, I believe, had a Chautauqua back in the 19th century and still has it today, or it died away and then they revived it again. So, take, for example, the one closest to us down south, Defuniak Springs in Florida. They ended their Chautauqua in 1928, the same year many others did. And then in 1993, a group of people decided to revive it for a 4-day Chautauqua. And they've been doing it each year except this one because of the virus. Um, I've never attended, but every January, they've got quite a program. Uh, every January for about 4 days over a long weekend. And they use the same buildings for the most part that were built for their Chautauqua back in the early days. Boulder, Colorado, has a continuous Chautauqua, has been a continuous Chautauqua since 1898. And one thing different about the Boulder Chautauqua is that it's the Chautauqua grounds are so close to downtown Chautauqua, this downtown Boulder, rather, this really quaint pedestrian area. You could walk here. I think it's maybe a mile and a half from town. So it's the grounds are used year round for music festivals and the like. So the traveling Chautauquas did come to an end. And if you wanted to read more about it, this is the book I'd recommend. I wrote this one and it came out in 2019. But as a matter of fact, just about every decade since the traveling Chautauquas ended, there has been a new book about the traveling Chautauquas. And I'm sure there'll be another one in the 2020s. Every one of them is articulate, eloquent, and the many of them are memoirs, and I found them fascinating to read about. But my book tries to pull together a lot of these books that are out of print, and that's where I end. I want to first of all give my sincere thanks to Sherry Levy for inviting me. I met her at Rollins several times, and I've really enjoyed. This is the first time I've ever spoken about this topic to a group. I want to thank Steve Bertha for all of his help in making sure that the PowerPoint would work today, and I want to thank you, the audience, for attending and listening to me. And if there are questions, I'd love to open it to a question and answer session. Thank you.